Well, good morning. Appreciate your attendance this morning. Hope that what I have prepared and have studied is going to be something that will be beneficial to you as Christians, and at the very least, interesting in the sense of this is a parable that I was not very familiar with. Not spend a whole lot of time studying it prior to this, and it just was one that honestly fell in the line of all the parables that were presented previous to that in chapter 15. If you remember, the last time I spoke, we covered the whole chapter of Luke 15, and this parable follows right after that, and it just piqued my interest, and I wanted to talk about that with you this morning. As I said on the last time I spoke, parables were short, fictitious stories that usually illustrated a major point of some kind of point, a moral attitude that you're supposed to have, correcting a certain behavior, something like that. It had a moral backing to it, not just a story, but there was a purpose behind it. And that the story is itself a window in which a larger reality can be depicted. We talked about how the Good Samaritan was a picture of how we're supposed to treat our neighbors as a whole. We talked about how the parable of the prodigal son, what it was actually talking about, being about lost souls, right? You see the bigger picture through the narrative of the story. And at the end of Luke chapter 15, he's talking about the fact that an elder brother was not happy that the younger brother came back. And we focused a lot on the fact that there was self-righteousness in that older brother. And that's the end of that chapter. That's the end of Luke chapter 15. And following Luke chapter 15, he dives straight into this story, dives straight into this parable, and that's what we're going to do right now. And I find it very interesting because I believe these two chapters are very much tied together. I know in our Bibles, we read that Bible and we see it as, okay, chapter 15 is by itself. It's its own little piece. And then we see chapter 16 and we're like, oh, that's its own little story by itself. But in reality, this is a conversation that Jesus is having. So he's going to be talking, and he's going to be talking through all of this together. And so in a way, these are connected. We're going to start by reading the parable in Luke chapter 16. We're going to read verses 1 through 11. He also said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into the everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? What happened just now? We're talking about self-righteousness in chapter 15, and all of a sudden we're talking about being basically crooked and an evil person. What's happening here? What is this transition that's occurred here in Jesus' story? That's the struggle I was having looking at this parable. It just doesn't make sense. Why is Jesus giving us a story about, quite honestly, some crooked dealings, if you want to look at it that way, right? From our mindset, he's giving us a parable, a story about something that doesn't sound very ethical, does it? I want us to break down this parable a little bit, and we're going to try to I really want us to focus on understanding the pieces of this parable because it matters to why he is even giving this parable to the listeners, the disciples that were there, as well as the Pharisees and scribes. So first off, I want to mention the characters in this story. We're talking about a rich man. Jesus doesn't say whether this rich man is a good person or a bad person. Just a rich man. It says a certain rich man. Right? The rich man had an expectation of good management from this person that he hired, right? It's pretty safe to assume that this man had a bunch of wealth and he had somebody taking care of it. That's steward, or another word for steward is manager. So this man is over all of this stuff and he's got somebody working for him. The second person in this story is the steward, the person in charge of this whole man's wealth. The accusation that we see right here, it says there was an accusation that was brought against him that this man was wasting his goods, wasting the rich man's goods. That word waste is basically to squander. The same word that was used by Jesus in the previous chapter to describe the prodigal son. Wasteful. So this guy is completely squandering everything that this rich man has, that this man has put him in charge of. You know, whenever you work in a company and you have responsibilities, the company is like this rich man. They have ownership of this company, right? They have certain expectations. And then you as a person that's employed there, you're working for them to meet those expectations. If you don't meet those expectations, what's going to happen? Literally what's happening in this story. Give an account for what you're doing. You're messing up. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're wasting the things that have been given to you, and you're going to get fired. The last piece is the debtors. Last characters in this are the debtors. And I find it interesting because they owe some extremely large debts. The 100 measures of oil, I did a little bit of research to understand what that meant, because you kind of look at some of these measurements in the Bible and you don't really understand what they mean sometimes. I don't, at least. It came out to about 900 gallons of oil. Gallons of oil. 900 gallons of oil is about 100 measures of oil. And then the other guy owed 100 measures of wheat, which is about 100 acres of wheat. Now, I want you guys to really think about this. We're not talking about a time where we have modern farming equipment, where you can take care of 100 acres of wheat quickly. This is manual labor. This is a large debt that this person has to this rich man. That rich man has some words with this steward, and he says, "You're about to get fired, buddy. There's an accusation brought against you. You're about to get fired." Either he believed it or something. I don't know. But he says, "You're going to get fired." And so what does this guy do? He says, "You know what? I don't want to beg. I'm too proud to beg. And I'm too lazy to work with my hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some dishonest dealings here. I'm going to tell these debtors that owe my master a certain amount of debt, or what he's loaned them, and I'm going to cut those in half." Man, I always wondered, or cut them down. I always wondered, why did he pick the numbers he picked, right? Like, why 50%? And then why 20%? What was the reason behind it? I found it very interesting in the Jewish culture, and in Deuteronomy chapter 23, you weren't supposed to charge interest to your fellow countrymen. So the Jews were not allowed to, if they were having to give loans out of land or food or anything like property-wise, you're not allowed to charge a loan of interest or anything like that on that. You couldn't charge that. It was against the law. Sounds great, right? Sounds great in theory, and initially it was, I'm sure everybody followed that to the letter, did it accurately, but then, as time goes on, people are like, man, there's a loophole here. We can get around this law. So in the time of Jesus, what would happen was a normal practice. If you had to loan something out to somebody, you ensured that you would make that money that you would get in a interest payment by charging double or charging an amount above what the actual value of this item was. So in this regard, the 100 measures of oil was probably a larger number than what was actually loaned out to this person, this debtor. And so what would happen is they would charge 100 measures of oil when you only really got 50. So what's happening here is the steward, goodness, I may need some water or something. The steward is about to get fired, and he says, I've got nothing to lose. I'm not gonna get anything out of this. Nothing to lose by doing this. So what I'm gonna do is cut all of the interest that this man was gonna make. I'm gonna cut it out of his bill. And by doing that, I'm gonna ensure that I've got a place to go. I'm gonna ingratiate myself to these people that owe my master money. They are gonna like me. And then when I get fired, I've got somewhere to go. And I find the outcome extremely telling and really interesting. The rich man commends that unjust steward. Instead of being mad, because I'm telling you, if I loan money out and somebody cuts out my interest and you find out that there's some really shady deals going on, I would be mad, right? You would be mad. You didn't get to make the money. Thank you, Thomas. You'd be mad. But instead, the master says, man, you got me. Good job. You got me. The master commended the unjust steward because he dealt shrewdly. Now, was Jesus praising that dishonesty? I've at times heard people say things like, well, we need to make sure we're getting our best options out of these certain trades or these certain things. These are good Christian people saying, man, let's try to get our best foot forward out of this situation. Let's mess up the situation here to make sure that this is done right for God and all this stuff, right? Almost like justifying dishonesty as if the means justify the end. Do you think that's what Jesus is teaching here? People have used this passage. I've heard people use this passage to justify that. That's not what Jesus was praising. He wasn't praising the dishonest nature and the going behind the master's back and all of those things. That's not what he was teaching or even praising here. What he was praising here was, the shrewd nature in which that steward dealt with this problem that he had. The cunning nature in which he dealt with what he was doing. How does that, what's the purpose? It's an interesting story. It's kind of odd in a way, right? But what's the purpose behind it? Why would Jesus be trying to tell us this story, and why would he care about being shrewd or being cunning? The next verse or the next sentence, I think, is what's really telling to why Jesus even says this parable. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. The sons of the world, people in the world, are out to get their best deal. They're out to get look out for me. I'm out there to get mine. I want what's mine. I want to make sure I'm taken care of. I'm looking out for me. And we praise that, honestly, in our society. We praise that type of mentality in our society because it's cunning. You end up getting value out of things, right? But for some reason, the sons of light, Christians, don't take that same sort of cunning and attitude when it comes toward preaching the gospel. When it comes to making sure that what you do benefits God, we want to make sure we get our benefit out of it. We make sure we get our money. We want to make sure we take care of us. But when it comes to how we operate in the church, we'll put in a little bit of effort here. We'll take care of business as we need to, but we're not going to be cunning. We're not going to use wisdom. We're not going to be wily. We're going to just barely get by. I believe that is the purpose that Jesus has for this parable. Be cunning. Be shrewd in your dealings. Make sure you're using the gifts that God has given you for a purpose. Now, there's obviously application out of this parable that I want to bring out. Lessons in stewardship. Using our wealth, using our resources, using them shrewdly. I want to keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through this. Being cunning, being wise in how we do this stuff. And then also, while we're doing it, we're having an eternal perspective. Lessons in stewardship, we manage God's resources. You don't own anything. In the beginning, God said that he was going to have man put into the garden. He created all things. He created the earth. He made it. And then he said, you know what? I'm going to have man on earth to manage it for me. We as people are managers of what God has. In our society, we like to say, this is my land. This is my job. This is my car. This is my food. But in reality, what we're doing is we are managing what God has already created. Guess what? When you die, it's no longer yours, right? We understand that. It's no longer yours. It's still going to be here while you're gone. Somebody else takes over the management of that. So when it comes to understanding that you have a responsibility as Christians to be cunning and wise with what you do on earth, understand the reason that you're given anything is because God has allowed you to have those things. And you are only a manager. And with that management, he expects faithful management. Luke chapter 16 verse 10 says, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. I think there's I'm going to try to say this delicately if I can. There's an expectation at times within our culture that we look around and see how well somebody is doing, and we say, I want that. Man, I wish I was like that. You got all this stuff. He's got all this material stuff. He's got all of this. I want to be like that. But we don't see the hours and hours and days and years of faithfully working through and struggling and all of those things that it took to get to that point. We don't want to be faithful when we have a little bit so that we can be to the point that when we have a lot, we're faithful there. We just want to get to the end goal. We just want a lot. Jesus says here, he who is faithful in a little. You may not have a lot right now. That's okay. You may not have a lot, period. That's okay. Are you faithful in that management, or are you going out and wasting your life? Are you wasting the resources that God has placed you in charge of? Like that wasteful and unjust steward. Are you wasting it away just because you can? God gave you resources. God gave you a life. God gave you talent. God gave you all of those things to use faithfully. You may not have money. You may have a bunch of time. Are you using it wisely? Or are you wasting it away? The lesson here is stewardship. The reason that man was getting fired was not because he was making bad business decisions of, I don't know what I'm doing. It's because he was wasting everything, not doing his job. It wasn't because of a mistake. It was because of a lifestyle of not fulfilling his role. You are given a responsibility to be faithful in your management of your time, of the gifts that God has given you, the money, resources, all of those things. And if you can't do it there, why do you think you're going to be able to do it with a lot of money or a lot of resources? Faithful management. Therefore, if you've not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, or an unrighteous mammon is basically another phrase for worldly goods or wealth, money, things of this life. If you can't be faithful in unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? Ooh, that's a little harder, doesn't it? If you can't manage your life on earth faithfully, why would God trust you to manage his house, his church, live life in a way, be an effective member of his community? Why? If you can't take care of business, the statement that this man made is, this is what I will resolve to do. I will put, that when I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. This man planned. Terrible way of doing it. Let me cut out all of this money that my boss was going to make. Definitely not ethical, right? Not a great way of going about to be a good person, but he had a plan to make sure he was set up so he would have somewhere to go, right? And this lesson for stewardship, do you have a plan? Do you have something set up in your mind, in your life, a goal-oriented way to make things happen so that you are faithful? Or just going through life, I'll figure it out as we go. Are we being shrewd, wise, and cunning in how we handle what God has given us? Making a plan. You know what the end of this life is going to look like, right? You're going to die. Are you planning for all of that? Are you planning for your life? This man knew he was about to be fired. In the time he had left, he chose to do something wise with it. What are you doing with your time that you have left? Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Jesus is calling us to be wise. Jesus is calling us to be shrewd and cunning. Make smart decisions. Look at your finances. Look at your time. Look at the jobs you choose to have. Be wise. Make good decisions. Because at the end of the day, it will end, and you will have to give an account. You will have to give an account of how you lived your life. This man was about to have to give an account for his stewardship. Was he a wise steward or a bad steward? Obviously, he knew the answer, because he's already making a plan to have another job lined up, right? He knew the answer. He's been bad. He's been a bad steward. But for us, at the end of life, we're going to have to give an account, right? How did you manage your life? How did you manage your time? How did you manage your resources? That's going to lead to this next point of using our money. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in your wealth and your money and what you've been given, entrusted with on earth, who will commit to your trust true riches? How can we be trusted to care for the things that matter the most, which is people's souls? Your children's souls. The person sitting next to you, their soul, if you can't manage your own finances, the way you deal with money. It puts our decision-making when it comes to our finances in a whole different light, doesn't it? This is what Jesus is saying. This is what Luke says. Jesus is saying these words. I'm not saying these words. It's uncomfortable. I get it. We're talking about the thing that people don't want to talk about in church, which is money. I get it. This is what Jesus says. Finances are a big part of this. How are we doing? How are we managing? Are we faithful stewards? Are we using them wisely? I go back to everything belongs to God. We understand that statement, but do we really believe that statement? Psalms 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, and the world and those who dwell therein. Both riches and honor come from you. You reign over all. You are stewards of your resources. But at the end of the day, they're God's. If we are only focused on ourselves and selfish desires and what we want, and only use it for what we want, only take care of us, we are that wasteful steward. We are that wasteful steward because we have been given these things for a purpose. For God. Use your resources for God's purpose. Verse 9 is just an interesting verse to me. It sounds so interesting. It just sounds odd to me. Luke chapter 16, verse 9 says, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. It took me quite a bit of time to really unravel what I feel like this verse is saying. It almost makes it sound like only make friends for yourself that have money. That's almost how I read that initially. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. I don't think that's what it's saying. Make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon. Remember how I told you unrighteous mammon, another word for that is your worldly goods? Make friends for yourself with your money. What is he saying here? Be generous. Be generous. That when you fail, they may receive you into the eternal home. Again, that part got me too. What is he saying there? They're going to somehow keep me protected in eternal life? That doesn't sound right either, right? By being generous and making friends, you are giving yourselves friends in heaven, okay? By using your resources to take care of and be generous and honestly open up relationships with people, you give yourself an opportunity to save their souls. So at the end of the day, your money, your finances, your resources are being used not for your own good and your own gain and all of those things. Instead, your finances are being used so that you can bring people to Christ. And they will be in heaven. When you die, guess where they're going to be? Because you've used your wealth and your resources to save their souls. Hebrews chapter 13, don't forget to do good and to share. For with such sacrifices, God is well pleased. Use your money, your finances, your resources, all of those things. To use those with the purpose, the shrewdness, the cunningness of the reason I am doing this is because I want to save your soul. Are you understanding what I'm saying? We're not just doing things just because. We're not just giving money to somebody, because You're struggling. The purpose is because I want to save your soul. What does that look like? I keep using the word money a lot, right? Hospitality. You know, when you have somebody in your house, what do you have to do? Not only do they sleep in a bed, you're washing those sheets, are you using water? Your water bill goes up a little bit, right? They're taking a shower, I hope. Water bill goes up a little bit. Electricity goes up a little bit. Do you see what I'm saying? Even within the simple act of hospitality, you're using your resources. You're using what God has given you in a stewardship way. You may be being hospitable to people for a very long time. Somebody may be living with you because they have nowhere else to go. Are you willing to use your resources in that way? Because their soul matters. Because I have the cunning and I have the foresight to look beyond the immediate and say, man, their soul is more important than the financial burden that's going to be on me right now. How about meals? You got to go to the grocery store, go buy the ingredients, go make it. You got to spend time making it. Using your resources, using our money. Medical assistance. Maybe somebody has a medical issue that they can't afford. That happens. Are you willing to use those resources at one time if you need to help them in that regard? Or are you saying, no, I'm okay? Hospital visits, you're driving. You understand what I'm saying here? Even in the simple act of mentoring somebody, that sounds like it shouldn't be anything that requires money, right? All you're doing is talking to somebody one-on-one. But if you're going to lunch with somebody, you're taking them out to drink some coffee together, spend some time together. It may even be some sort of activity that gets them to open up. And you're going to spend money. Are you willing to do that? With the end goal and the cunning and the shrewdness to know the reason I am doing this is to save their soul. Or are we caught up in the immediate and saying, that's a lot of money. Do we have the internal perspective on all of this stuff? At the end of the day, that's what Jesus is talking about. The eternal perspective on all of this stuff. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. We already touched on this point earlier. I apologize. You know, Luke chapter 15, Jesus spent a lot of time leading up to the end of that chapter, right? If you remember, he's talking about the lost sheep. He's talking about the lost coin. He's talking about the prodigal son, and all these Pharisees and scribes around listening to that. And at the end of it, he hits them hard and says, self-righteousness is really what I'm talking about here. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money. You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The focus has been on money. The focus for these Pharisees, the focus for these religious elites was about what was theirs. Instead of looking at these sinners and tax collectors that were around them and looking at them and seeing the soul and lost soul like what he was talking to them about in Luke chapter 15, and instead of seeing that, they are saying, I'm doing everything right. I'm the elder brother. I am right. I am good. And instead of seeing those lost souls as and your money and your resources to be able to help those people, they're looking at it's my money. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Don't value money so highly that you're willing to put away somebody's soul to keep it. Understand the eternal wealth that's actually there. Their soul. Matthew chapter 25, verse 45 says, And he will answer them, and assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. This is that parable again that Jesus gives about those that had done what they were supposed to do. They had fed the hungry. They had given water for those who were thirsty, gave food, or they gave clothes to those that were naked. They visited people. And he looks at the people who wasted their resources. He looks at the people on the other side and says, when these people needed help, where were you? You claim to be Christian. You claim to be a God-fearing people, but when these people needed help, where were you? Prioritize eternal values. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. At the end of the day, you can have wealth. This is not a sermon against being rich. Not at all. What this is a sermon of, what do you prioritize? What's important to you? Is it the fact that you have wealth? Or is it the fact that you can use that wealth to serve God? Are you prioritizing eternal values? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. If at the end of the day, all we care about is our money and what we do on earth, and we want to make sure we have all the things here, that's where your heart's going to be. But if you value the lost soul, you're going to use those resources, large, small, whatever you have. You're going to use those to help God's kingdom grow, to serve in whatever way you can, so that they eventually, those people that you've helped, may be in heaven with you. They may be receiving you when you die, and you're looking and you see, that's that person that I was able to help. I believe Jesus is using this unjust steward as example, a good thing, and kind of almost a contrast. Using bad people to show us what we should be doing. We need to be good stewards of what God gave us. Whether it's a lot of money, whether it's a lot of resources, whether it's not, whatever. We have to be good stewards. We have to use our resources to glorify God and not to serve ourselves. And lastly, to have that eternal perspective on everything that we have. I hope that the study has been something to make you think. At the end of the day, that's what I want to get out of this. I hope it made you think about how you are using your resources. Am I a good steward of what God has given me? Think about that yourself. Am I a good steward? Am I wasting my resources? Am I justifying the way I use my resources, but it's really a waste? Or am I choosing every time to glorify God in my actions, to glorify God in my resources, to glorify God in how I manage? If you find that you're not doing that, or if you find that you may be the lost soul that needs to be saved, we can make either one of those things. We can handle and take care of either one of those things this morning. Please come as we stand and sing the song of invitation.